summary, if you would.
Yes, so I'm the son of Syrian immigrants. My family escaped Syria in 1966. The Ba'athist National Socialist Party, the party then of Hafiz Assad and his son Bashar, took over in 1963. My grandfather, Zuhdi Jasser, who I'm named after, was not only a prominent businessman but a politician and an advocate for democracy. In 63, when the Ba'athists took over, they were fascists. They nationalized his companies, stopped all media. He had a newspaper that was shut down. So my family, my father's family, moved into a very counter-regime role, if you will. That didn't last long. When my father finished medical school, he then escaped to Lebanon and had always been a believer in American and Western democracy. He had studied in London. And I count as one of the top blessings in my life the fact that my parents were able to escape Syria and decided on the United States to raise their family, just because I've been able to do things and live the American dream that I would have never. Had I been in Syria, I probably would not be alive today because of not only the revolution since 2011, but just as a believer and somebody who was raised to be open about my beliefs and my principles. I don't think I would have been above ground today. So my father was trained in Tulane. He's a cardiologist, then went to open a practice in Wisconsin. We moved to Wisconsin when I was 3. I was born in the United States. And most of my formative years were in Wisconsin, a small town south of Appleton in Neenah, Wisconsin. And they built the first small mosque in northern Wisconsin. And basically, until I went to college at the University of Wisconsin, my understanding of Islam was a very personal faith, pretty orthodox. My mother's father is a Sharia court judge in family law in Damascus, so they're all still there. My father had translated the Quran, one of his, I think, most significant achievements in his life, not only in our family, but in his legacy, is that he created a common interpretation of the Quran that really shaped a lot of how I interpret more difficult passages and the easier passages. So to me, until I went to college, Islam was a personal relationship with God. My faith was very God-centric. The Quran was a manual for that, but it was really a personal relationship with God. And Islam to me was about principles, morality, humility, character, integrity, and these things. Then I went to the University of Wisconsin. I was on a fast-track program to medical school called Target MD, and then signed up with the Navy to pay for my medical school at the Medical College of Wisconsin. And I was exposed to big city Islam, the Muslim Student Association, and these groups that all of a sudden took a faith that I understood to be personal, and it seemed to be a political party, a political movement. And I quickly, being an avid reader and studier and scientist, learned about the Muslim Brotherhood. And I was exposed to a lot of them because in Egypt and the Middle East, the Brotherhood, the Ikhwan, are called the Ikhwan al-Muhandisin, which means the Brotherhood of Engineers, because most of them are scientists and engineers. They're not trained in liberal arts and liberal sciences typically. So as a pre-med, I was exposed to a lot of these guys. I lasted 3 months in the MSA. Quickly realized that they were anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, anti-American, realized that they were not about Islam, they were about their own political agenda, which I found nothing in common with. To my mother's suggestion, I went to the largest mosque in Milwaukee to go to Friday prayers, which was really just a half a mile from the university, and was exposed to an imam in 1985 that was preaching that America was in Afghanistan, not to fight the Soviets, but to imperialize and destroy Islam, and that the CIA was trying to take over the Mujahideen, and all these other conspiracy theories. And I remember going to the imam multiple times and saying, listen, I'm taking time out of my school to come and pray and learn about my faith, not get a political lecture from a guy who knows nothing about politics, let alone history. And he said I really didn't have a right to question his authority. This is what Islam is. And slowly, and I think this history is really important because I didn't come to counter Islamism or my battle against the Brotherhood groups in the West and understanding this just post 9/11. This has been part of who I am. It was a bit on a hiatus after I joined the Navy. I was finished medical school in Wisconsin, and then did my internship and residency at Bethesda Naval Hospital. But I think the bedrock of who I am as an individual was that my family taught me that this country gave me the ability to practice my faith, choose which parts of it I want to practice, which parts I don't, in a way that no other Muslim majority country could have ever done. So I really viewed my Americanism as my primary identity and my faith as a personal identity. So I never viewed it as a collectivist state issue, if you will. And that pit me immediately against all of these Muslim Brotherhood group movements. Was in the Navy, set aside my activism for a while. And then I was active with the head of the endocrinology department at Bethesda Naval Hospital, who also was President Bush's endocrinologist. You may remember he had AFib and other things at the time. And he was Muslim, and we decided to go present a paper at the Islamic Medical Association. I talk about this in my book, Battle for the Soul of Islam. And sure enough, this was in 1995, the keynote address that opened ISNA, and we weren't there for ISNA, but we happened to be there, the Islamic Society of North America, which is the largest Muslim organization in America. The keynote address was Siraj Wahhaj, a pretty radical imam that is originally from the Nation of Islam, that then transferred into Sunni, so-called mainstream Muslim Brotherhood Islam. And his speech, basically, he held up the Quran, and it was basically an anti-abortion speech, and said that this country is fated to be evil because it's not following God's word, it's following Bill Clinton's agenda and others, which is based in secular hedonism. And ultimately, he said the only way to bring about truth is to replace the Constitution with a God-given document, which is the Quran. I was in my uniform there on leave, listening to this, saying, I can't believe what I'm attending. And I went to the microphone and said, do you guys realize what you just, and this was 15,000 people, they give people opportunity to sort of announce to the convention what they have booths for, and I went to say this, which was, I'm publicly renouncing any involvement in this organization. I'd recommend anyone who takes their citizenship oath seriously to abandon this organization. This keynote address was an abomination and sedition by any stretch of the imagination, and realized that their leadership, at least, I don't know about all their members, but their leadership at least was a separatist movement, which was no wonder what the MSA created. It was this Islamic Society of North America. What struck me was not only his speech, but the fact that nobody disagreed with it. Nobody, a few people came up to me and said, well, we agree with what you said, but you took it too far. He really didn't mean 1% of the population is going to take over a country. Long story short, went back. My professor at the time then said, I can't believe you said that, but I'm glad we got the heck out of there. And realized we have a big problem. Then in 1999, I joined my father in practice in Phoenix, Arizona. He had moved from Wisconsin to Phoenix. And then 9/11 happens, things that I thought would just happen generationally, where the old guard of the Islamists that ran our mosques, ran our organizations, would slowly melt away and dissipate into the dustbin of history. I realized we didn't have time for, that the battles and the wars happening in the Middle East came to the Twin Towers, came to the Pentagon, came to Pennsylvania, and that we needed to do something. And I really realized that when on the front page of the Arizona Republic, the main newspaper, was an article in November 2001 that said, American Muslims torn with loyalty to Islam and loyalty to the U.S. And I read that and I said, who the heck did they interview? And I looked, they interviewed every imam in the mosques in the Phoenix area, in Tucson, and nationally that they could find. And I realized that we had a major, major leadership problem, and they not only were not ready for prime time, they were really enemies of the state in their ideology. So we needed to begin to create institutions, and in 2003 we formed the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, which formalized a mission to separate mosque and state, to counter, people said, well, why don't you just fight terrorism? Why don't you what is this separation of mosque and state? I said, this is the disease. You go to your doctor, I'm a doctor. Do patients come in for me to cure their cough and give them a cough suppressant and morphine to kill their pain? Or do they come in for me to fix their disease and figure out what they have first, and once I diagnose it, treat the disease? The disease was the Islamic State concept, political Islam. And that's why in 2003, our mission was to counter the Islamic State idea and separate mosque and state. Nobody really understood it until 2013 when ISIS came up and they said, oh, now we understand. So, that distinction between, what is the distinction between Islam and Islamism? I would tell you, first of all, it's not something that's peculiar to the West. In the Islamic faith, you have the faith of Islam, which we believe is the name God gave our faith in the Quran. And then you have in Arabic something called Harikat Islamiyya, which translates to movements that are Islamic. Hamas, H is Harikat, Muslimin, so it's an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, a terror group. So Islamism, just like communism, socialism, capitalism, are societal political ideas that believe that those ideologies should dominate whatever political party they have and whatever movement they have. So Islamism is a political movement that believes that it should set up party apparatuses that then when they get control of government would then govern from an Islamic identity for that state. And the instruments for that Islamic identity are Islamic law, Islamic jurisprudence, or Sharia. Now, Islam and Islamism have huge overlapping circles. My mission, our mission, I think the only way to solve the terror, the threat to the West, is to separate those completely, is to defeat political Islam into the dustbin of history and maintain Islamic identity. Islam as a faith, Islam as a word in Arabic, taslim or salim, one of the derivations is peace, but actually the core root word doesn't mean peace. It means to submit to God or submission. And the peace comes from the fact that your soul will achieve peace when it has submitted to God and God's will. So that's the derivation of it. Islam is the faith that I think is defined by the Quran, the Arabic Quran, our practices, our pillars of faith, which are prayer, fasting, charity, zakat, completing the Hajj, and belief in God. So there are practices that define what Islam is. My family always taught me that Islam as a faith is based on the way God evaluates you and how you do with the choices that you make every day. So the most Islamic societies are those where you live in a society where you have the capacity and the freedom to sin. So if I choose not to drink as a Muslim, I need to live in a society where I can choose to have a beer or not, because otherwise God can't judge whether I'm practicing Islam. If you force somebody to pray, that's not Islam, because God isn't judging me. He's not able to judge me because the Saudi police is making me pray or making me fast. So, to me, Islam is a personal faith practice between me and God, and it's based on the issues of honesty, integrity. My mother used to teach me, as my grandfathers did, that the truest Muslims you can tell are the ones that are honest to the finest comma of their integrity, of never wanting to hurt a soul or an animal or an insect or whatever it is, that they treat their loved ones and people in the community the way they would want to be treated. It's all about character and integrity. That is Islam. That's worth much more than whether you pray openly and show everybody that you're doing your prayers, or whether you attend mosque and yes, that's important. Community is important for education, for socialization, etc. But that's not the center part of the faith. The faith is integrity.
You're describing Judaism.
Yes.
Or Zuhdiism.
Well done. No, Islam. That's
unbelievably, a senator in the U.S. Senate called you an called your organization Islamophobic. Would you tell us a bit about that?
So I think that example of how from the floor of the Senate, Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut decides to, in a mental gymnastics of basically wanting to again demonstrate that it doesn't matter what the collateral damage is that the left or the right uses, everything has to revolve around how do we get and label the other side, the other party across the aisle as the demons. So in his speech, he was trying to demonize Secretary Pompeo in his nomination process in the Senate. And he identified organizations that Congressman Pompeo from Kansas had worked with, and ours was first. I had written a number of op-eds with Congressman Pompeo, had worked with him to expose one of the largest mosque in his district that had brought in a Hamas sympathizer to fundraise. And I said, there's nothing more pro-Muslim than the community there in Kansas marginalizing and shedding the light of day on how evil that imam is. So Senator Chris Murphy reads and says, Secretary appointee Pompeo has worked with the most Islamophobic organizations to demonize Muslims in Islam, including the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and then he goes on to list other non-Muslim organizations. And you realize that A, he's getting his talking points from the Brotherhood legacy groups in America, the Khomeiniist groups, the Iranian apologists, the AKP groups, the group running Turkey now. The government is run by another Brotherhood type organization. So it could be any of those lobbies that basically want to marginalize our ability to influence government. So I think it typifies two things that's important to learn from his ignorance. We then, by the way, demanded an apology, sent a press release saying, we'd love to meet with you, Senator Murphy, but for you to call a devout, pretty orthodox Muslim board of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy Islamophobe shows that you're not only ignorant, but you're libeling us from the floor of the Senate, slandering us. And it shows that you're actually working with America's enemies. And that the values that supposedly a far left-leaning senator would value, which is women's rights, gay rights, other things that we are defending within our organization against radicals that are actually homophobes and misogynists at the Islamic Society of North America and elsewhere, he demonized us, all in the interest of partisan politics. So one is the ignorance of the reality of what diversity is in the Muslim community. Two is the hyper-partisan nature in which everything ends up being about how to get the right, etc., without really looking at what he's talking about. So Saudi Arabia, in the scheme of things, if you look at a faith community of 1.6 billion people, why is it that a country of 30 million people matters that much? Well, the center mothership mosque of our faith is where the faith originated in Mecca and Medina. And the Grand Mosque there is the direction to which Muslims pray. So the royal family has milked that to the nth degree by saying that they are the designated custodians. I mean, I was on the U.S. Commission on Religious Freedom for 4 years until I termed out in 2016, and I went to Saudi Arabia 3 times. And it is something that comes out of their tongue every time they mention themselves, is that they are the custodians of the mosque. So they were handed that in the early 20th century, and they're never going to let it go. Having said that, they have a bully pulpit that has been exaggerated because of petro-Islam. So you take 25 million people that are run by one family that would be otherwise irrelevant had it not been for billions and billions of dollars. And former CIA head Jim Woolsey said that the information operation from the Saudis has been $100 billion between 1960 and 2010. $100 billion simply in information, where they had been working with spreading Islamic supremacy interpretations, spreading the legal school of thought that their judges teach. Even the Parliament of World Religions, our organization, sent a protesting member and sent a letter of protest to the Parliament at Salt Lake City 2 years ago, because the keynote was the head Sharia court judge of Jeddah and the head of the chair of the Parliament of World Religions, which is supposed to be like the Olympics that meets every 4 years of interfaith work, was funded by the Saudis. So here you have the Olympics of interfaith work about religious freedom and liberty, funded by a country where there's no churches, there's no synagogues, not even a variant interpretation of the Quran. They have one interpretation, which was the fascist one from their government. So you have a laundering operation globally by the Saudi royal family to launder the type of Islam, of their Islam being the only Islam. So fast forward to 2018, and President Trump was handed a Middle East that had basically gone from a post-Cold War Middle East that had balkanized itself, that now had a major opportunity in 2011 where I wish my grandfather and my father had been alive to see the massive opportunities that existed with the Arab awakening, where finally dictators were on their heels, some of them were disappearing, and you had the only solutions beginning to happen against these ossified dictators, which is ground up reform. Reform will never come top down. And yet, what is the long-term strategy? So unfortunately, President Obama abandoned the Arab awakening, did nothing, and abandoned the Green Revolution in 2009 in Iran, gave lip service to some of the movements, but basically did nothing and allowed those vacuums to be filled by radicals, by Russia, by whatever, I call it the Darwin doctrine. Obama's doctrine was really the Darwin doctrine. And basically shifted American policy post-Cold War from being on the side of the Sunni side of the equation of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc., to being on the Shia side, where at the altar of the nuclear deal, we handed Iran hundreds of billions of dollars, free reign for their missile program, free ability to spread terror into Syria and into Lebanon and threaten Israel, and basically created, and I think partly because of Valerie Jarrett and other interests there that had significant Iranian history, the influence of the North American Islamic Iranian Council, NIAC, that lobby, the Khomeinist lobby, ended up shaping Obama policy. Trump comes in and basically now is recalibrating the stability that we had at the time of Eisenhower, Kennedy, and onward post-Cold War, which was the Sunni-Shia balance in the Middle East. In order to do that, though, we're losing the massive opportunity we had in 2011 where these dictators were put on their heels. And now I'm hearing verbiage from the White House that they have to do in many ways to reaffirm the friendships that Obama had abandoned. So to answer your question about, well, what about the slow progress they're making? There's an old joke about Hafiz Assad in which they had come up to him and he was shooting his generals one by one that weren't following his orders. And one day he decided he wanted his generals to teach a mule how to speak English. And he shot them one by one, and then one said, fine, I can do it, but give me 15 years. And he went back to his other officers, and they said, how the heck are you going to teach a mule to speak English? And he said, well, in 15 years, either I'll be dead, the mule will be dead, or Hafiz will be dead. So this is the plan. This is what the Middle East does, is they put you on a string. They have a 15-year plan. Saudi Arabia now has a 2030 plan. They're starting to let women be on small little councils. They're letting them drive. Meanwhile, in the last 6 months, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, has put more women in prison than they had in the last 10 years. So bottom line is there's going to have to be revolution, just like treating cancer. Patients often get sicker. Sometimes they die when you're trying to treat that cancer, but you need to treat it. And Iran went through a theocratic 40 years, and I think they will come out of it healthier, even though as long as we make sure they don't get nuclear weapons, the world has had to deal with a radical Islamist terrorist government in Iran. Saudi Arabia might get more radical if the royal family steps away, but I think that normal maturation process has to become part of our policy. And the short answer for Saudi Arabia, and this is in my book, I have a chapter on changing the paradigm. The post-Cold War paradigm was that we were either friends or enemies with dictators. I think we need to start grading our foreign policy from A to F. The Pakistans, the Saudi Arabias of the world need to be openly told that you are a D-, if not an F+ when it comes to human rights, when it comes to all the standards we keep. You're not our friends when it comes to democracy and your people, but we will work with you against common enemies, and we will help you transition in a finite period of time with benchmarks. That's never been our policy. We've embraced dictators in exchange for regional stability. And as Condoleezza Rice said in 2005 in Egypt, she said, for too long we have exchanged regional security for stability, and we've gotten neither. Because those governments, the Saudis, if you look at what created ISIS, the founding fathers of ISIS in Syria were the Saudis, ideologically. And now they might be pulling away, but at the end of the day, you can't extinguish those ideas by working with the founding fathers of those ideas. It's interesting, my naysayers will always say that my political aspirations are the end game of this, and yet, meanwhile, we have Islamists like Keith Ellison. Yesterday, you see Conyers seat in Michigan now is probably going to be filled by the first Muslim woman. But it's not a surprise that all of the Muslims in Congress so far have been identity politic Muslims that are right out of the casting of the Islamist movements globally, because they feed on identity politics. It's not about diversity within Islam for the Keith Ellisons, the Andre Carsons, and now the Rahida Tlaib, the Democratic primary winner in Conyers district. I don't have specific political aspirations, but I do think that ultimately, sadly, the primary platform for progress in the United States is the political platform. So, if the opportunity were to arise, I would look at it seriously. But I do think that the bigger issue is my legacy about reform. I think that ultimately, every day I just turned 50, and I look at what I'm leaving behind for my kids. Political aspirations is not really the primary legacy. I think the primary legacy is leaving behind for them a faith that they're proud of, that they feel that they can love passionately America and have an interpretation of Islam that's not in conflict with that. And right now, 99% of the books that you were to pull off a shelf or Google are going to be books that would put that in conflict with them and for their kids too. So that's ultimately my primary goal, is to continue that mission. And if there are other platforms that allow me to serve, as a naval officer, I will tell you that I'm not doing this mission because I want to repair my faith. That's God's faith. That's not my role. But I do believe that global security and the security of my kids, your kids, is going to be impacted if a quarter of the world's population continues this process of radicalization and being taken over by a struggle between two demons, which is Islamic theocrats or secular military dictators, both of whom don't give a hoot about America when it comes to it. That radicalization process is going to continue to create ISIS's and Islamic jihads, Hamas's, that will be continuing this whack-a-mole program unless we fix where Islam is in its history. Islam is 1,438 years old. Christianity, when it was around its 1,500 anniversary, had some major wars. I think that's not a coincidence. And my legacy in whichever platforms I have, I hope is to fast forward through the bloody parts of that and to have a coherent strategy, short and long term, for that. Thank you.